Hello, I am here honestly with two of my most favorite people in the whole world. And I probably have said that before, but I really do mean it this time, even though you only see one of them. His lovely wife is on the other side of the camera, and we could not convince her to come over here, but sadly, because she's pretty awesome too. But I'm here with Brian Kirk at GFA headquarters in the United States in Willis Point. And Brian is the head of church relations here at GFA World. And as you know, we have the founder of GFA, KP Yohannan, as a speaker on a radio station. And so we thought it was really important that you, as our listeners, would also understand more about this wonderful ministry, how it was founded, what the future is, what they're doing now. If you haven't had a chance to read KP Yohannan's book, it's a free book you can get from their website. Revolutions in World Mission is a fascinating read, and I think every Christian believer in the world should read it. So, but anyway, let's get right to the guy that knows everything about this lovely ministry. And I've just had a tour of their facility here, and it's just fascinating how much they do and all the things that they've reached out. And we're sitting in their little museum here of all the different things that little touchstones that were KP Yohannan's, and that were also parts of the different ministries in all the different countries. And it's just it's an amazing little section to tour and to see all that you do. And I've learned so much more myself, even though I thought I knew quite a bit, but I don't. So Brian is, I've gotten to meet him at several different conventions and gotten to know he and his lovely wife, Michelle. And so I feel like I already know you, but I know our listeners don't. And I just kind of wanted to start off with, how did you end up here at GFA? How was your journey that led you to be a part of this wonderful mission?
Well, first of all, welcome to, it's great to have you. So we love Jackie as well. So it's just a blessing to get to see her, lots of hugs. And so for me, my journey really started not long after I came to know the Lord with the book that you mentioned, Revolution World Missions. And so I got a copy of that, and to be honest, it really turned my world upside down, because as a newer believer, full of zeal, passion for the Lord, I was busy doing everything there was to do in my church, helping with Sunday school, usher, going on outreaches, small groups, prayer meetings, all those kinds of things. But when I read the Revolution and World Missions book, I realized that even though I was doing all the right things, that really my life was still all about me. It was about me doing the right things. It was about me, my family, my neighborhood, my church, and so on and so forth. And that my heart didn't really break over the reality of 80,000 people dying every day without ever hearing about Jesus. And so that Revolution book really helped me understand how today on planet Earth, there's still around 3 billion people waiting to hear the gospel for the very first time. Jesus died for them, gave his life for them, but they've never heard what he did for them. And so for us as a ministry, that's kind of our heart, is to reach those people. And so as I read this Revolution book, it ended up being a revolution in my life. And a world map went up, prayer for the unreached, but really it was the heart change that really fueled it all. And I can't say that I've got it wired or anything else like that. I still, every day, it's a battle to say, no, it's not about me. It's about Jesus. It's about other people, especially those who are waiting to hear the gospel, like the parable of the 99 sheep and the lost sheep. And so read the book, started sponsoring Missionaries, started volunteering, so on and so forth, and eventually went to hear the founder, KP Yohannan, speak at a church. And while I was there, he considered coming on staff. And I'd been having this amazing time with the Lord the 2 or 3 months leading up to that, like 2 or 3 hours a day in the Word and prayer, and it just wasn't enough. And when I looked, I realized that everything the Lord had been speaking to me was pointing directly at joining GFA. And so answered the Lord's call, had to raise support, and started with the ministry in April of 1999. So it's been 26 years now. Wow. And quite a journey.
Wow.
Quite a journey.
So tell us about KP Yohannan and how this vision came about to do this type of mission work, which was pretty revolutionary is the word at the time, because this is not how mission organizations functioned or worked back in the 80s.
Yeah. So when he launched Gospel for Asia at the time, actually it started out as Gospel for India. But we quickly started helping beyond India, so it became Gospel for Asia. And now we've actually transitioned to GFA World because we're also in Africa, so Gospel for Asia doesn't fit anymore. But when he started the ministry in 1979, his idea was very much a challenge to the missions world because he actually himself was Indian. So he wasn't American. He came over to the U.S. to get his seminary education at Criswell Bible College in Dallas, Texas. But before that, he served with a mission organization called Operation Mobilization. So while he was in India, southern India, there was a man by the name of George Verver, who was the founder of Operation Mobilization, came to his village and really challenged the people in that area to give their lives for the sake of people in northern India who had never heard about Jesus before. And he was blown away that people in his own country had never heard. He didn't realize that was true. So he answered God's call, served at OM. But when he was serving there, it was people from Europe and America, but also a lot of Indians as well. And so when he, fast forward to 1979, God breaks his heart afresh over people in his own country without the gospel, people in Asia, and all the people who had never heard the gospel before. He initially wanted to go back, but God said, you need to actually raise up support for the missionaries that are back in. And so like those Operation Mobilization missionaries, he began to raise prayer and financial support. And it just started off him and his wife and a few people praying around the kitchen table on a Tuesday night, not knowing what to do, seeking the Lord. And now that's grown to over 15,000 churches planted in just countries, across Africa and Asia, and millions of people worshiping the Lord. But they sold everything they had. Basically, they walked away from the American dream, started living for the sake of the gospel, and began doing everything they could to potentially to help people who were preaching the gospel. And they quickly realized that what they had was so little compared to the need, and so they started recruiting other people to try to get them involved in helping them. And next thing you know, ministries were born. So.
And what's so fascinating, though, about GFA is that y'all focus on Indigenous missionaries.
Yeah. And that's what was so controversial, because prior to that, it was almost like the term national missionary or indigenous missionary was almost a dirty word in the Western missions machinery, if you will. Mm-hmm. The mindset was very U.S.-centric of, we are the ones with the theological training. We're the ones with, hundreds of years of Christian heritage. We are the ones that can be trusted, not necessarily the people of Africa and Asia and so on and so forth. And so coming from that background and knowing, I remember one of the people he knew, the man was literally selling his own blood in order to finance his ministry. And at night, struggling to do ministry in this totally unreached area, he'd basically feeding his children lemons in order to make sure they had enough nutrients in order to survive. But he knew brothers and sisters like that who were sacrificing, were following the example that Jesus had left them for the sake of the gospel, and thought, these men and women can be trusted with the good news of Jesus Christ. Mm-hmm. And so rather than, sending Westerners, that's what he did, was support these nationals. And the underlying heartbeat for him came down to the idea that, or that maybe the question of how do we reach the world with the gospel? Like in his mind and his heart, it wasn't okay that anybody hadn't heard about Jesus. Mm-hmm. But he looked at the current missions model, and even though the U.S. is sending so many missionaries, the reality is that we'd never be able to send enough to actually reach all these people, especially when you start talking about restricted countries in the 1040 window, from 10 latitude north to 40 latitude north. You can count about 95% of the unreached people in the world live in, from West Africa to East Asia, in those countries. And so whether you're talking about Nepal or Burma or Pakistan,
where Westerners are not welcome.
Yeah, they're not welcome. So
much less Western missionaries.
Yeah. So you can't go as a missionary to Afghanistan. So how do you reach the people of Afghanistan? And so in a number of these countries, a lot of them, there are already indigenous believers there. He thought, why do we have to go through this whole roundabout way of getting Westerners into there to train indigenous? Why don't we just trust the indigenous people themselves to run Bible colleges, to train people on how to preach the gospel, how to hand out gospel tracts, how to pray for the sick and cast out demons. And it ended up that, these people coming from backgrounds where they knew what spiritual darkness was like, first generation believers, first people ever to hear about Jesus, sometimes from their own tribe or region or whatever else, and end up being tremendously effective with sharing the gospel.
One thing that so fascinated me about KP Yohannan's life and the journey in which the Lord prepared him to to do something like this was that how the Lord opened up not only having a heart for the lost. I mean, that's probably the first step that has to take place if you're going to be an evangelist or a missionary of any kind, but also his need that he saw to discipleship and how that was just as important. I mean, those two had to go hand in glove. Elsewise, you're not even starting to do the Great Commission.
Yeah. Yeah. So when he worked with or served with Operation Mobilization, one of the things that he did was actually live out of the back of a van with a team of other missionaries going from village to village preaching the gospel. And so, I mean, they saw God do amazing things. They saw miraculous healings and everything else. They went through all kinds of persecution and struggle. But after a number of years, he was kind of curious to see what God had done. And so he went back to some of the places where he'd seen God do the most amazing things, whether that's the number of people who came to Christ, miracles, or whatever else. And he realized there was no church, that there was no remnant there. And so he really began to understand that the church was God's method for producing disciples. And if you look at the book of Acts, what the Apostle Paul perpetuated was sending missionaries to plant churches, establishing elders, and going from there. And so that's was kind of a very much a foundation for the rest of his way of understanding missions. The sheep without a shepherd are scattered, as Jesus said. And so to be able to raise up people to actually disciple, to pour in their lives, and to, because Jesus didn't say go and just tell people. I mean, Mark 16:15 says, preach the gospel to all creatures.
The Great Commission is go and make disciples.
Go and make disciples. And unless you plant a church, and just like Paul did, and leave elders there and so on and so forth, there's no way that disciples are actually made.
Another thing that I thought was such an interesting insight into the Western Church was how the culture shock that he had when he first came from India to America and came to Criswell Bible College in Dallas, Texas, of all places, and how he saw the Western Church. That was, and I thought, it hasn't changed much since, sadly, it hasn't changed much since then.
In some ways, it might have even gone backwards. But
yeah,
it was definitely a culture shock. I remember he was one of the first airports he was in. He was trying to find some cheap food, and he saw a hot dog there, and he literally thought, like, Americans eat dog? They do that? I didn't think that. But so he came from a place where people didn't have big homes or multiple like all different kinds of clothes or whatever else. He was like, you have 2 or 3 pieces of clothes that you wear, and you wash them, and you wear them. And
he didn't have shoes until he was like 17.
Yeah, he wasn't 17 years old before he wore his first pair of shoes. Yeah. So, and he had spent just, as I mentioned, years and years going from village to village and just seeing people living in abject poverty. And so to come over here and to see just the absolute wealth of the average American, still today, comparatively, yeah, still today, I think I was hearing a statistic of something around, I think it's 40% of the world's population lives on $2 or less a day. And so that's like the reality for so much of the world. But I think the thing that really saddened him was that he saw that with all the physical wealth, there was a lack of spiritual wealth.
Yeah.
And so he was used to like going to a church, and when the church calls a prayer meeting, like everybody in the church comes to the prayer meeting. But he went to this church, it was like 1,000 people, and he goes to the prayer meeting and it's like 20 people or something. He just couldn't understand. And so, and his mindset, so much of following Christ was embracing the cross, sacrificing, fasting, sharing the gospel, doing everything that Jesus did.
Holy living. Just you would think those would be so basic to a Christian life, but yet they're not, and they're sadly not in our Western culture.
I remember one time I had one of our leaders from the mission field, was him and I was over here in the U.S. and we were driving in the car, and someone drove by me with a Wicca bumper sticker, or drove by us with a Wicca bumper sticker. And I pointed out the car to him and I said, that person's a witch. And he said, really? I said, yeah. He said, I didn't think there were any witches in the U.S. I thought everybody in the U.S. was Christian. I said, no, we've got witches too. And he got really quiet and he was thinking. And you could see as he's processing this, he goes, well, that makes a lot of sense though. And I said, really? He said, oh yeah. He said, there's a lot of power in witchcraft, but Western Christianity doesn't have any power. So it's understandable why Americans would want to become witches.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
Oh,
What
wow.
I meant.
Oh, wow.
You know? And it was his idea of power was exactly what you're talking about. Victory over living for this world as opposed to living for the next one, about living a holy life, being freed from sin, you know, being able to pray for the sick and you know, seeing them healed, being able to share the gospel, and there'd be power with that.
Yeah.
And so he didn't see that in the United States.
It's so amazing how just as well the enemy works in this situation where there's a lot of prosperity, a lot of comfort. We don't have any persecution. I mean, we might have our neighbor upset with us because we're trying to share the gospel with them. But as far as we're not being stoned and imprisoned and all of those kind of things, but how easy it is to just fall into that life of ease and to live our best life now and to seek that instead of seeking the kingdom and partnering with the Lord and what he's doing and how to cause his kingdom to flourish rather than just our own.
You know, with so many of our brothers and sisters, it's amazing like what they think of as normal Christianity. We had one of our former staff member was over on the field, a friend of mine, and he was talking to one of the leaders there, and he was asking him, "Have you ever been beaten for preaching the gospel?" And the leader looked at him kind of incredulously, like what do you mean? He couldn't understand the question.
Wow.
And he's like, "Well, have you been physically harassed or suffered violence for the sake of because you shared the gospel with somebody?" He's like, "Well, yeah, you preach the gospel here. You get beaten. That's just what you do. It's part of what you do." I remember one of the first times I was on the mission field, we had this young brother had just gotten healed miraculously, and what had happened was that he was one of our missionaries, and they were showing a movie on the life of Jesus, and some anti-Christian elements showed up, and with rods and stuff like that, and they began to beat these missionaries. Well, he was just a young guy. He was like maybe, I would guess, 19 years old or something like that, real young guy. And he's telling the story. He's like super stoic. He's just like, yeah. And then they came with rods, and they had some of them had metal rods, some of them had bamboo rods, and they began to beat us. You know, he was responsible for the film projector, so it was a video, like a video projector and like a VCD player. And so he's like, I need to protect this because God's people gave money for this. This is God's stuff. And as he was carrying it, he was trying to, people who came to beat them were trying to hit the equipment. So he was trying to protect it with his body, and they hit his hand. And as he told how he dropped it, he started to cry. He's like, God gave us this thing and I didn't protect it. Well, when they did x-rays of his hand, they had shattered his hand in something like 18 places and stuff like that. Like they beat his hand. By God's grace, he was miraculously healed and his hand fully restored just like in a day. But the interesting thing was he said, I was always scared of persecution. And now that I finally endured it, it really wasn't that bad, and I'm no longer afraid of being beaten. But, we have stories all the time of missionaries, whether it's being beaten. We've had some that have literally been killed for preaching the gospel, jailed and in prison. A missionary my wife and I personally support, he was actually jailed for 2 years for showing the life of Jesus on a film in a village. And the amazing thing, so he was put in this jail that was real high altitude, and all he had was to sleep on was a board and a blanket. So he either put the blanket under him or on top of him. And he had severe asthma as well, and it was acting up. And when their leader contacted him, said, "We're going to come visit you. Is there anything we can bring?" He didn't mention a blanket. He didn't mention his asthma medicine. He said, "There's people in this jail who don't know Jesus. Can you please bring some gospel tracts and some Bibles because I have an opportunity to share Christ with them?" And so it's just really just the heart of so many of our missionaries.
Yeah. Do you have any personal stories that working here, being a part of all this, that have just truly changed your life? I mean, changed it as far as in your relationship with the Lord, not just necessarily your outlook or the way you see the world or missions or the lost, but just you personally, how has it transformed your heart?
Yeah, I think, there's a couple of things. I think as far as like committing my life for the sake of reaching the lost, I had a sense of calling to GFA and that was real. But I remember there's an incident where we had one of our leaders on the field. He was actually a friend of mine. And we had a situation where they had a Bible college in one state of a certain country. Can't name the country, a restricted country. And it ended up that what they were doing in this one Bible college is that they were recruiting missionaries from the next state nearby, bringing them back, training them for 3 years, and then sending them back to this other state where they came from. Well, the anti-Christian element in that other state caught wind of what was going on, and they said they told the Bible college, if you don't stop, we're going to come and we're going to burn down your Bible college. And we get threats all the time, but the leaders realize like this is actually a serious one. Like this is legit. They're actually going to come and do this. And so our leaders and our Bible college students began to fast and pray, and the group that was going to come and burn down the Bible college said, hey, we're going to come in such and such a night to burn down your Bible. Well, my friend, we'll just call him John, he didn't live on the campus. He had a wife and 2 kids, and he had a home just nearby. Well, that night he realized like I need to be with my sheep. Like I'm the shepherd, and if they're going to be there, I need to be with them, because they sent a message to the leaders of the group saying, greater is he that is in us than he that is in you, and you can come down and try to burn down our Bible college, but you won't be able to. And so my friend, John, he kissed his wife and his 2 girls goodbye, thinking that he may never see them again. And he went to the Bible college to be with his students. Well, it ended up that the group did come, but they were met by the same group that was based in the state where our Bible college was, and said, look, this is our territory. If anybody's going to burn down this Bible college, it's going to be us. So you just go back to where you came from and we'll take care of the situation here. And I remember hearing that story and realizing like I was so used to hearing about missionaries who were willing to die for preaching the gospel or being beaten for the sake of sharing Jesus in a place where he wasn't necessarily welcomed. But here's a man who just for the sake of the glory of God was going to lay down his life for, as a testimony of God's goodness and grace. And I don't know what it was, but something snapped in me. It was the Lord really used that to speak to me. Came home thinking, I'm going to die doing this one way or the other. And so ever since then, that has been really something that's a switch that's really like just been flipped. And it's just like, I don't know what else there is to do than to do everything you can to reach as many people with the gospel as possible. I remember I was in England, and I was speaking at a missions conference, and I had actually a college professor come to pick a fight with me. And this guy was a Hindu. He was a very, very smart, very educated man. Listened to what I had to say, and then came and picked a fight with me. And to be honest, Jackie, this guy was using words I didn't even know what they were. I didn't know what they meant. And like this guy was like so much smarter than me. But I'm sitting here and I'm just listening to him, and I'm praying, and I'm thinking, okay, Lord, what do you want to say? And I'm just struck with how much Jesus loves this guy. And I look at him and I said, you remind me of me before I came to know Jesus. And he's like, Orphan. I said, I said, one, you don't really believe your argument. You just like the argument. And I said, but let me ask you this question. If you were me and you believed that people die apart from Jesus and they spend an eternity in hell, would I not be the biggest hypocrite if I didn't do every single thing I could to save as many as possible, to tell them about Jesus so that they could get a chance to believe in him? And he looked at me, and he just was just like, you just like seeing him go, oh my, he didn't say it, but you could see it in his face. And he goes, yes, you'd be the biggest hypocrite if you didn't do everything you could. And we ended up hugging and everything else, and had a great conversation afterwards. But I think, situations like that, as far as what it means to actually, that there's a world waiting to know about Jesus. But I think one of the things, with our founder, KP Yohannan, he was really wired to just love people. That's why it was so important that we reach people with the gospel. It wasn't okay that anybody hadn't heard about Jesus. Like, as long as there was somebody, like, what can we do? What could he do? But I think along with that was the understanding of the need for brokenness as Christians, that it's not about, like, what are we going to do? Like, what are my spiritual giftings? What great thing am I going to accomplish for God? But, Jesus, what is it that you want to do to reach my neighbor? Like, what is it that you want to do to reach, the people of Somalia or Morocco? And then how do I come alongside what you're doing to reach these people? And just living in that place of understanding, no matter how smart I might be, no matter how rich I might be, how capable I might be, that's all flesh. And it's the Spirit that produces spirit. It's the flesh that begets the flesh. And being able to take whatever God's given us, to surrender it to him and just say, Lord, this is for you to do stuff with. What is it that you want to do? That it might actually be a work of the Spirit rather than just my thing, in Jesus' name.
Yeah. I think too that so much of the Western church, I think one of the traps that we get into is, we talked about this a little bit earlier, about we have that to-do list. Okay, we can do all of these great things for Christ. We can build this, and we can have this program, and we can, even do things like reach the homeless in our community, and we can do all these things. And those to-do lists might be good and well, but if they're not being led by the Spirit, if we're not doing what we see the Father doing, joining that, then we're kind of like sounding gongs and clanging cymbals.
Yeah, definitely. I know in the history of GFA, there's just been situation after situation. We sensed God wanting to do something, and we didn't know what it was. And so, but we didn't understand it. So, for instance, we had a situation where, in a restricted country, we had a group of people approach us and say, and like this is like millions of people, leaders of millions of people saying, will you help our children? Like our only hope of a better life is if our children can get educated. And at the time we thought, well, yeah, we'll do that. We'll help their children so that we can share the gospel with them. But as we began to actually genuinely care about the children, and as the Spirit kind of took over that ministry, we realized, like, Jesus had compassion for the masses. Like, that's what the apostles recorded over and over and over again, whether it was, feeding the 5,000, whether it was cleansing the leper, whether it was casting out the demon or raising the son of the woman who was, so grief-stricken, at Nain, whatever else, that he genuinely cared. And as we began to take care of these children, we realized, wow, this is Jesus's heart. And so it was amazing, because as we began to genuinely care about the suffering of people in this world, their temporal suffering, it was amazing how God used that so that we would actually be able to share Christ in a more genuine way. And as he embodied that and everything else, we saw more people come to Christ than we've ever seen before, because it was both the love and works of Jesus, as long as with the gospel, Jesus married together. And it was both the mission and ministry that Christ had. And so, so we've just been able to see just God, over and over again do things like that, where we didn't know what he was doing, but if we followed his lead, it's amazing just how things
the doors
exploded.
open. Yeah. And that's what's I think so difficult. And, in the United States, we have the means, we've got most of the time the money, we've got the resources, we've got materials, we've got people to do things. And so it's so easy to just get caught up in the doing of things. And that's almost easier to do rather than waiting on the Lord and seeing what he's doing and waiting to see how he supplies, or just doing what he's doing and then see how he supplies. He comes in behind you and supplies. And I think that's so much harder to do, is to wait and follow the Spirit and see what the Lord is doing that way, rather than just, I can do this, and so I'm going to fill this need and get this done.
Yeah, we have a prayer meeting every Tuesday. It's just no matter where you go in GFA, whether it's an office like this in one of the other 7 countries that we're in, or if it's a headquarters in a country, or a church, or whatever else, a Bible college, we have a Tuesday night prayer meeting. And so in one of our Tuesday night prayer meetings, it's about 2 years ago, maybe a year and a half ago, the time I was our development director, and I was sharing just and asking for prayer because we were facing just felt like we were facing just difficulty, just moving things forward. And I sat down next to our founder's wife, and she began to ask me questions, and I was saying, yeah, it just seems like everything's so different. And she asked me the question. She says, well, how much time have you spent fasting? And part of me just went, she had to ask that question. And because, it's just, it was like when you go down that road, and it was like, it was definitely the Lord speaking. And I shared with the staff, like my team of leaders, and we all knew, like, okay, the Lord's calling us to fast as a group of leaders. And we began to fast and pray every Wednesday together. And, it's just easy. I mean, to be honest, it's easier just to work, is it 50 hours a week or 60 hours or whatever, put in the time than it is to say, okay, I'm going to deny myself by fasting and praying. I'm going to spend this extra time on my knees seeking the Lord. And it's almost like you pay a price inside.
Yeah.
Versus
that's a good way
external.
To put it. Exactly.
And it's like, like you were talking about, not the list, and we were talking about John chapter 12, where Jesus says, unless the grain of the wheat falls in the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it does die, it bears much fruit. And then Jesus goes on to say, if anybody wishes to be my or to serve me, he must be my disciple. Or, sorry. If anyone wishes now I got the quote right.
No, you did it so beautifully earlier.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite quotes it's actually my favorite quote on serving the Lord. If anyone wishes to serve me, he must follow me, and where I am, there my servant will be also. There we go.
There you go.
But there's that aspect of, am I willing internally for that grain of wheat to die? Or do I just want to be busy for Jesus and do ministry? Or do I want to come in that place where, like Galatians 2:20 says, no, it's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself. And, are we come to that place of where it truly is Jesus versus us? And that's much more painful than paying whatever price you have to, where there's an outward price.
Yeah. Well, because it requires a breaking. There has to be a real brokenness, and not in a sense of, I don't have a good self-esteem. That's not the brokenness that Christ is calling us to or asking of us. And it's not even something I don't think we can do ourselves necessarily. It has to be a work of the Holy Spirit in us. And one thing that's so remarkable about the work of the Holy Spirit in our lives is that, Jesus said that, unless you are born again, you can't enter the kingdom of God. But unless you're born again of the Spirit and fire, you won't be able to. Well, you'll see it anyway, I'm messing that up totally. What I realized too in my own life is that if I'm allowing the Holy Spirit to work in my life, I'm allowing to move and to fill me, he always brings fire. And then that fire is that burning up of myself and my own ideas and my own control of a situation or an issue or other people, or even a ministry or even what I think God should be doing. All of that has to be burned away. Yeah, and we're not willing to do that necessarily.
And I think that was one of the special things about the founder, KP Yohannan. I mean, he was one in a billion people. I mean, they were just amazing visionary, amazing love for people, just amazing love for the Lord. But he was probably both simultaneously the most broken person I've ever met along the lines. But because of that, he was probably the most human person I've ever met. And I remember one time he was sharing about, like, there's a difference between dying to self and denying self. Dying to self is where you basically, you look at all the desires of your flesh or whatever else, and you're able to say, that's not me. And you die to that, so that you say, you align yourself with the Spirit, saying, this is what the Spirit of Christ in me wants. And this is really what I want. Where denying self is you go, well, I want that. And you say, no, I don't. Well, I want that, but I'm not going to take it. I'm going to deny myself from that. And you're like, oh, I want that. No, I'm not going to do that either, because I want to do what Jesus wants. But that ability for that self to be broken, where you go, no, I don't really actually want that, because it's not about me. It's about Jesus, and this is what Jesus wants. I remember one of the times, I don't get mad at God a lot, but I can remember one time when I got mad at the Lord, because the way I understood life with Christ was, it's almost like I have an apartment building, like me as a person there. I have an apartment and it's got 2 bedrooms, right? And the way Christianity works is I'm in my apartment. Jesus knocks at the door. I invite him in and he stays in the guest room, right? And now he's, and he tells me what to do and whatever else. But I realized one day that was not accurate. That what it is Jesus knocks on the door and says, this is now my apartment, that I move into the guest room and he moves into the master bedroom. And now he's the one actually, it's his. Like I am his. Like that's the exchange. That's the whole point of Galatians 2:20 is what we call the exchange of life. Like I get everything that Christ has to offer if I'm willing to let him have all that I have to offer. And my lack of experiencing the life of Christ comes down to how much I'm holding back. What parts of my life am I keeping him from having that I'm not willing to surrender and to give over? And what I found is there's so many times where, like, the Lord's like, give this to me, give this to me, give this to me. And I'm like, no. And then I finally give it to him. And he's like, okay, just like Abraham and Isaac. He says, okay, now that it's mine, you can do all that you want with it. It's okay.
Yeah. Well, GFA World is so much more than just planting churches and Indigenous missionaries and pastors and growing up elders and discipleship, because there's also this practical arm of GFA in that you're digging wells, and there's the Sisters of the Cross that are ministering to in the slums of India and leper colonies and all those kind of things. There's the compassionate arm where you're giving mosquito nets and blankets and all of these things. So what is the future of GFA?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, we had that shift where it was more towards, or adding compassion ministry, understanding that Jesus didn't dichotomize people. Like he didn't is this a spiritual need or a physical need? I'm pro one or there. He saw people as whole people and he loved them as whole people and ministered to them as whole people. And so as we talked about earlier, Gospel for Asia is now GFA World because we have begun to started ministry in Africa. And currently we feel like the Lord's establishing like 2 bases for ministry for us. For East India and Northeast India is the country of Rwanda. And then in West India
Africa.
My wife is Africa, not India. I'm sorry. In East Africa and reach Northeast Africa, but then in West Africa is the country of Liberia. And so it's been a real Macedonia call. It wasn't something that we decided to do, but it's a long story. But basically, just say is one of those things where the Lord made it happen, and we were just following the Lord's leading. And one of the things that has really gripped the heart of our founder before he went to be with the Lord was the lack of medical care on the continent of Africa. And so there's so many things that we take it for just granted that people can't even dream of. I remember knew somebody who had people visiting from mission field and church, whatever else, and they were sharing in the church, and they were like, it's amazing how much America's been blessed. And they said, do you realize like your dogs are more blessed than the people of my country? We went to one of your pet stores, where they sell food and stuff. And they said, it's bigger than our stores for people. Like you have more varieties of dog and cat food than we have food for us as humans. And like the medical care you have for your animals isn't available to most people. Like you can have cancer treatments and, all different kinds of stuff for your pet. But like in the country of Rwanda, they don't have one cardiologist for the public people in that country. So, and there's one doctor for every 200,000 people in the continent of Africa. And so that really broke, our hearts. And so we started actually a medical college and hospital. We're in the process of building it. By God's grace and Lord willing, we'll have it like the soft launch in the spring of next year, sometime around May and June, and Lord willing, the hard launch at the end of 2026. And so, but the reality is we have a hospital to help the people of Rwanda, but the medical college is just as important because that will enable us to train medical missionaries from all over Africa in order to go all over Africa. And can you imagine like people taking the love of Christ and starting a medical clinic someplace and sharing the love of Christ, but then also being like these people's first opportunity to ever see a doctor in the history of their area. And then that clinic grow into a hospital and you know, the gospel going forth from there. So you see both the good news of Jesus and the love of Jesus being shared simultaneously. And so, so really, you know, that's part of it. But then also in Liberia, by God's grace, is we've been able to start outreach for children. In there, we start up we call community transformation projects. And really, our hope is that whole aspect of, you mentioned compassion services. How is it that people are suffering, and how can we help the local community? If they need clean water, how can we get them clean water? If their children need help with education, how do we help their children? If they need income producing animals, how do we, you know, it enables us to get them income producing animals. Being able to be part of the community, not just from the outside, but actually, you know, it's one of the things about Indigenous national missionaries is they're from these places.
They know the need.
They know the need, and they can live amongst the people as the people because that's where they're from. And so we can train them, send them out, and they can start these, you know, community projects. And by God's grace, now we've already are helping over 1,000 children in the country of Liberia. I don't know how many children we're helping in Rwanda, but I think it's in the thousands as well. But then we've also been able, we're able to send out our first national missionaries in Liberia. Unfortunately, they're not able to be sponsored because we already got them all sponsored. But the Lord's doing it, and He's opened doors. And so, so we're praying, we're seeking the Lord. And again, it's just like always, is we could strategize and come up with all these plans, like we're going to go here, go there, and go there. Right. But basically, we're just step by step following the Lord's leading as He's opening doors in new countries for us. And there's a number of new countries, both in Asia and Africa, that we're in the process of following Him to, as far as like doors are opening and new ministries are starting, but not allowed to actually share about those.
So how can our listeners help? If you're listening to this and you see, oh my gosh, I want to be a part of that, I want to support this ministry, what can they do?
So one of the things, if they're unfamiliar with the Unreached world, if you will, or that whole concept, or you know, they're thinking, wow, this is such a foreign world to me. One of the things we always encourage people is to get our free book. They can go to gfa.org/free book, and they get a copy of Revolution World Missions. It's the reason.
Read it. You may end up on staff here. It's powerful. It's powerful.
Changed my life. So they can get that book. But one of the things always is part of the reason I've been a part of this ministry for 26 years is I don't know anything more effective that someone can do to reach people with Jesus than sponsor a national mission. And so they can go online. There's a sponsor button. They can go there and they'll see national missionaries.
And those funds go 100% to that?
They used to, but unfortunately at this point they don't. But basically, it takes up to 10 people to sponsor a missionary. Okay. And so from those 10 people, at $45 a month in their prayers, they can basically help send a national missionary to reach a village that otherwise would never get to hear about Jesus. And so it's a situation for me of just, I remember when I first joined GFA, and at that point it was $30 a month, but you know,
cost of
inflation
living.
and cost of living, everything else, everything's gone up. I just remember thinking, I mean, $30 a month in my prayers makes it possible for an entire village to get to hear about Jesus and for potentially a church to be planted in the village. Like, this is too easy. Like, why doesn't every Christian do this? I just don't get it. And I'm still that way today. Like, $45 a month in your prayers, you can, I mean, like, you can barely take your family out to eat for $45 a month. Go
to McDonald's and you're going to spend that. I mean, gee whiz.
Yeah. And so, like, you can exchange, or, I don't know how much like TV subscriptions are, channel subscriptions, but, if you take it down to one streaming service, you could reach a village with the gospel. But then also one of the other great things is that we have going on with the Christmas season. We have a Christmas catalog. It's online. You can order a physical one if you want. But we found, especially for, like say, older people with kids or grandkids who are wanting to share what it means to reach people with the gospel, that it's a super tangible way for kids to get what it means to help other people. Because like they can pick out a pair of chickens. I think it's $12 for a pair of chickens, or to provide for a family that will help provide an income, or a pair of goats for, I think it's like $80 some for a pair of goats. And I remember meeting it was one village. previously Unreached with the gospel, and met this one couple, and they couldn't afford to send their children to school, but we were able to get them a pair of goats, and that pair of goats had baby goats, and it ended up as they do. And it just ended up that it was actually, they could sell one goat, and the cost of selling that one goat was what it took to actually put a kid through school. And so as they start off with, selling one goat, and then they could put one of their kids in school, but pretty soon there was a lot more than just 2 or 3 goats. There was a lot of goats that they could put all their kids through school. So, but then that also introduced the love of Christ to that couple as well in a very practical, tangible way. So.
Okay, and how could our listeners be praying?
Yeah, so in a lot of places on the mission field right now, persecution is drastically increasing. And so if they could pray for our brothers and sisters, our missionaries, imagine that you're in a place, somebody shows up talking about this God that you've never heard of. This God shows up in a miraculous way, and whether it's sets you free from demon possession, heals somebody in your family, delivers you from alcoholism or whatever else, you realize like this God is the real God. This is the true God and I'm going to give my life to worship him. And you're just never heard of Adam. You've never heard of Moses. All you know is I'm just, believing in Jesus, and you start getting taught, out of the Bible and so on and so forth. And then people show up and start saying, unless you turn away from this Jesus, we're going to beat you, or you're not allowed to drink from the village well anymore, or whatever else, both for the believers as well as our missionaries, as they are there for their the sheep and help them get through these situations. So that's definitely a need on the mission field right now. One of the things is, it's interesting with this hospital. It is the biggest project we've ever taken on.
It sounds enormous.
It's huge. Financially, it's a huge project. But for us, what we see is, it's interesting because if somebody 40 years ago or 45 years ago would have gotten involved with GFA and started sponsoring missionaries, like they would have had no idea that they were at the front end of a movement that would reach, countries, millions of people across countries across Asia, and that it would have that kind of impact. Well, it's almost like winding that clock back, except now it's Africa. If the Lord's led us to do this, so we know he's going to provide, but we know that prayer is often the thing that moves the hand of God. And so if they can provide, pray that the Lord will provide the finances for this hospital, that we can see it reach, that the Lord will provide the staff for it. Because think about it, there's a shortage of doctors in Africa. Yeah. Where are we going to get doctors for
staff the hospital?
So we're going to have to start trying to staff it with people coming, whether it's Europe or the U.S. or whatever else, coming and helping and stuff like that. We have people coming from other countries where we already have established work to also help. But so pray for this, because if the Lord can establish this hospital, we think that this is just a huge, win for the people of Africa, both as far as getting medical care as well as helping to take the gospel to them. And then too is, we're establishing our first Bible college in Liberia. So if people can be praying that the Lord would raise up missionaries for that we can send them out and just see just a new wave of Indigenous missionaries going across Africa.
I know too that you mentioned that there are opportunities to serve.
Oh, yeah.
Here in this facility, even here in the U.S., but Canada, you have a center there as well, and other parts of the world. If someone feels so compelled after watching this to join or to look into feeling that call, maybe the Lord is calling me to serve in this way. What would they need to do?
Pretty much all of our country websites, if it's gfa.org or gfa.org-nz for New Zealand, or gfa.org-au for Australia, or so on and so forth. If they go to any of our websites, they can find a country, all the different countries that we're in. But there'll be a Get Involved section on those websites, and they can go there, and there's a joint staff. In the U.S., we have a 6-month apprenticeship program, especially for younger people or people who are kind of maybe in between situations. They can come serve for 6 months, see if this is something the Lord might be calling them to. But otherwise, joining staff. And we have volunteer networks in a lot of the countries and so that we work in. So maybe they don't feel like they can call, they can join full time and give their life full time, but there's a way they can give out Revolution books or share in their church or represent GFA at conferences and get the word out that way as well.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time, Brian, and Michelle as well. Y'all, it's amazing ministry here. And so I hope you will take time, go to their website, read the book, do what you can to help support this ministry, even if it's just telling your neighbor, telling your church about it. I know that y'all send representatives out to help talk to churches as well. So call them up and have them come and see you and share this wonderful ministry with your congregations. But thank you again.
Thank you, Jackie. It's always a blessing to see you.